We're going to examine the National Decision Model. As is often the case, at first glance it might appear complicated. However, when explained in a step-by-step way, hopefully it'll be pretty straightforward. If we consider the steps involved in brewing a cup of tea, there are about 10 steps and it would take a lengthy blog to detail them. However, we can all make a cup of tea very quickly despite the lengthy process. It's the same with the National Decision Model. People trained to use it make almost instant decisions following its principles, and it provides the ability to rationalise decisions, which in a world where police decision-making is being more frequently challenged, is a useful advantage. Decision, a definition. The word decision is derived from the Latin and is defined as the action of coming to a determination or resolution with regard to any point or course of action, a resolution or conclusion arrived at. What is a decision? This seems an obvious question. However, it's the mental processes resulting in the selection of a course of action from among several alternative scenarios. Every decision-making process produces a final choice. The output can be an action or an opinion of choice. When do we make decisions? We all make many decisions every day, important or trivial, unique or routine. We make decisions constantly as we travel life's path, from something simple and mundane like deciding what to have for breakfast or what clothes to put on, to the more life-changing like should I go to university, should I get married or divorced. Some of those decisions can even be life-threatening, like should I run a red light, climb a mountain, wrestle a bear, and so forth. Many of the more mundane everyday decisions are made automatically or subconsciously, and many not even register in your mind. At the other end of the scale, some decision-making might be protracted and have significant emotional impact, like deciding to end a relationship or to emigrate. Your job or role probably requires you to make decisions, and depending upon that role, they may have far-reaching implications for both you and the organization. The organization relies on all its employees taking appropriate and timely decisions at all levels, and encourages all employees to become involved in decision-making. The organization wants you, when appropriate, to make decisions, and unsurprisingly, it wants you to make good decisions. And it's for this reason and others that the National Decision-Making Model was developed and introduced. Organizational structure and decision-making. An organization's structure affects how and where decisions are made. They may be made at a strategic, tactical, or operational level. In large organizations such as the police, a traditional hierarchical structure is the norm, each level possessing different levels of authority. Senior officers, the command team, decide strategy. Managers decide how to achieve the strategy, i.e. make tactical decisions. Officers and civilian employees carry out instructions at an operational level, making decisions as appropriate. Authority for major decision-making is concentrated at the higher levels among few staff, whereas at the other end of the scale, low-level decision-making may be made by all staff depending upon role and responsibilities. Strategic decisions are those which affect the long-term functioning of the organization and which relate directly to its goals. In the police, they are usually taken at the highest levels of management. In the case of the police, at command team or even commissioner level. Potentially, they carry higher levels of risk, but if correct, effective strategic decisions can bring significant results. So, for example, the decision to employ police community support officers, a strategic decision, could engender closer ties with the community and bring greater public satisfaction. Or it could provide a service the public want at a lower cost and free up police officers for more important tasks. Tactical decisions are medium-term decisions. Whilst an incorrect strategic decision could take the organization in entirely the wrong direction and lead to failure, an incorrect tactical decision would have a more limited impact. Strategic decisions are usually in place for protracted periods of time, whereas tactical decisions tend to be more changeable. If a tactic fails to achieve outcomes, it can be adjusted or changed. So, for example, a tactical decision to deal with a spree of burglaries might be to increase police patrols, which might have an immediate effect in the area but displace the crime. Whereas targeting known offenders and instigating a positive prosecutions policy in conjunction with bail and curfew checks might be a longer-term solution. Operational decisions are the day-to-day decisions made in fulfilling our individual roles and responsibilities at all levels and are made considering the risk to the organisation. These decisions are very often the here and now type decision. For a police officer, they might include the decision to arrest or not, to stop and check or not, to drive onto a particular estate or along a particular road, and so forth. For someone with an administrative role, it might include obtaining particular information, using specific equipment or software, communicating with another agency, making sure that operational staff have the tools they need for their job, and so on. Operational decisions are the low-level ones that are the bread-and-butter decisions that allow the organisation to do its job. Often, they are administrative in nature and can be implemented quickly and tend to carry little risk. Operational decisions may be smaller scale, but are nevertheless important choices that people have to make to fulfill their roles. At all levels of the organisation, there are constraints on decision-making. The command team, for instance, cannot decide to make available unlimited funds to finance a new communications system. There may also be technical reasons why an action is not advisable. Constraints on decision-making are sometimes organisational. Some people at some levels cannot have authority to decide because they lack the knowledge or skills. At other times there can be economic, political, environmental or legal constraints. All job roles carry specific responsibilities, decision-making powers being delegated throughout the organisation. This means that people do not have to await a decision from a higher level. Very often that would be completely impractical. Tasks can be completed quickly and efficiently, which is better for the organisation and the public. What constitutes a decision? Decisions are made at all levels of the organisation. For example, the Chief Constable might decide to reduce the number of staff, to implement a particular policing methodology, NPTs, to set up a specialist team or department, and so forth. A divisional commander might decide to make a particular department responsible for solving a problem or issue, the staffing level of a department or initiative, the priorities for the day, and so forth. A team or shift sergeant might decide how resources are deployed at a serious road accident or a live incident. A patrol constable might decide to effect an arrest, issue a fixed penalty, offer words of advice or instruction, and so forth. An analyst might decide to suggest resources be deployed in a particular area to deter antisocial behaviour or to detect crimes in progress. A receptionist might decide the best way of dealing with a customer's inquiry or the best way of dealing with a problem. There are, of course, many more decisions each person may make. Very often, with a great deal of thought, they just get on with it. However, the more complex decisions might benefit from the more structured approach offered by the National Decision-Making Model. Why do we make decisions? We've demonstrated that decision-making is something we all do, and for the most part we do effectively in our personal lives. Considering our working environment, if we ask the question, why do we make decisions, there are essentially three circumstances in which we might make a decision. To choose the direction the organisation will take. These are usually top-level decisions made by the command team, the force's senior managers. To find different ways of doing things. These types of decisions are those that any of us might take. We very often look for ways to make a job or task quicker, easier, or more efficient or effective. To create an opportunity or to solve a problem. The last part is particularly relevant, I would suggest, to most of us, and quite definitely to police officers. Policing, whilst it has its mundane, repetitive aspects, is very much about identifying opportunities and problem solving. For example, whether it be looking for opportunities to improve the service we offer or better use resources, or solving problems relating to a particular crime or criminal. Despite what we think and may have even seen, good decision-making is not done by the seat of our pants, or reliant on the toss of a coin. Good decision-making is achieved by using a decision-making model. That's not to say some decisions quite rightly won't be done on the fly. Sometimes we have no choice and must necessarily make spontaneous decisions. But if we use that national decision-making model when we can, components of it will influence our decision-making even if it is on the fly. Good and bad, right and wrong. A good decision is not necessarily the right decision. Equally, a wrong decision isn't necessarily a bad decision. It is possible to make a good decision, one that was sound in the making, but for whatever reason turns out to be the wrong one. Unfortunately, most of us do not possess a crystal ball. Consequently, we cannot foretell the outcome of our decisions. We cannot be sure at the moment we make a decision that it is right or wrong, that it will have a good and positive outcome. A good decision doesn't guarantee a good outcome. Similarly, a bad decision doesn't necessarily result in a bad outcome. Nor is past experience any guarantee that what worked in the past will work again. As we shall see when we look at the national decision-making model shortly, what is important is the process of making the decision. Of course, we much prefer that a decision was the correct one regardless of process, but if a decision turns out to be the wrong one, far better that the process was correct than incorrect, especially if justification for the decision has to be made in a courtroom. Usually, a right decision means that the target or goal has been achieved. Bias in decision-making. Bias is an inclination, a mental leaning towards something, or a predisposition, partiality, prejudice, preference, or predilection. It arises from various processes that are sometimes difficult to distinguish. These processes include information processing shortcuts, motivational factors, and social influence. Examples of bias include, but not exhaustive, a selective search for evidence. This is where a person looks for information that supports their ideas or beliefs, but disregards information that contradicts them. If we have an idea, a plan, or a theory, it's ours to be protected and nurtured and favoured above all others, despite evidence that tells us that it is no good. Selective perception. We actively screen out information that we don't think is important, e.g. discounting of arguments with which one disagrees by judging them as untrue or irrelevant. Premature termination of search for evidence. People tend to accept the first alternative that looks like it might work. Wishful thinking, a tendency to want to see things in a positive light, which can distort perception and thinking. Recency. People tend to place more attention on more recent information and either ignore or forget more distant information. Repetition bias, a willingness to believe what one has been told most often and by the greatest number of different sources. Groupthink, peer pressure to conform to the opinions held by the group. Source credibility bias, a tendency to reject a person's statement on the basis of a bias against the person, organization, or group to which the person belongs. People preferentially accept statements by others that they like. Role fulfillment, a tendency to conform to others' decision-making expectations. Decision-making and risk. All decisions involve some degree of risk, and in making a decision we should be seeking to identify the potentially negative consequences and integrating that knowledge into our decision-making. It's not about eliminating risk, that's not possible, as even doing nothing carries with it a risk. For example, if you don't intercede in a domestic altercation, a murder might be committed. If you don't order toner for the copier, important documents might not be produced. The point is that every decision you make should include consideration of the risks involved. For each identified risk or threat, you should consider how likely it is that it will occur and how great the impact will be if it does. For each high probability risk, you should identify and consider possible countermeasures and include that knowledge in your decision making. This all sounds very complex and convoluted, but in practice it's usually very straightforward, of course depending on the complexity of the issue. For example, in arresting a suspect, a risk might include the consequences of arresting an innocent person. The risk is minimized by considering if you have sufficient grounds for your suspicion. We can't avoid risk, we can only manage it. Almost all of the things that we do at work involve risk of some kind, but it can sometimes be challenging to identify risk, let alone to prepare for it. However, it can be useful to consider risk under three headings: ethical, personal, and operational risks. Ethical risks. Ethical risks are concerned with personal dishonesty or a lack of integrity, simply the rightness and wrongness of our actions. For law enforcement personnel, it involves obedience to the laws of the land, the values and principles of the organization, and includes concern for health and safety of the public. In considering ethical risks, you should ask yourself, can you justify your decision? Is it proportionate and necessary in the circumstances? Consider the nature and seriousness of the crime or incident, the character and standing of the subject, and the consequences to that individual, and whether there could be disproportionate damage to the professional reputation of yourself or the organization. Personal risks. Personal risks are concerned with ascertaining whether there's a risk of personal injury to the public or others who may become involved, to a member of a law enforcement agency including ourselves, and to the suspect or offender. Law enforcement agencies have a duty of care which should not be ignored. We should consider whether a decision is likely to result in death or other physical injury of an individual, or whether concern might be created which causes psychological injury to an individual or the community as a whole. Operational risks. Operational risks are those that impact upon the standing and reputation of the organization as a consequence of its internal inadequacies or a breakdown in its controls, operations or procedures. Broadly speaking, they include the damage to community relations, bad publicity and compromise of a sensitive technique, a current operation or source, loss of a case at court, or a financial or legal liability. Operational risks overlap the other types of risks we have discussed. National Decision Model. The Association of Chief Police Officers, ACPO, approved the adoption of a single National Decision Model, NDM, for the police service in 2012. It replaces previous models such as the Conflict Management Model. The police service, and more specifically police officers, have been making decisions since the inception of the service. For the most part, those decisions, if not good, have been made with the intention of fulfilling the basic tenet of the service, namely to protect life and property, preserve order, and prevent the commission of offences, and where an offence has been committed, to take measures to bring the offender to justice. More and more the decisions made by the police are subject of challenge. It is important, therefore, that decision-making is improved. The National Decision Model is part of a concerted effort to ensure that decisions are made cognizant of the mission of policing and in accordance with the values of the police service. In addition, the model aims to enhance the use of discretion, reduce risk aversion, and support the allocation of limited police resources. What's in it for me? By understanding the National Decision Model and incorporating it into your working practices, it is hoped that it will help police officers and staff, you, to develop the professional judgment necessary to make effective policing decisions. In addition, it will encourage you to learn from decisions that are successful, as well as the small proportion that are not. ACPO have stated that decision-makers will receive the support of their organization in all instances where they can demonstrate that their decisions were assessed and managed reasonably in the circumstances existing at the time. And this applies even where harm results from their decisions and actions. What does this mean? For me, the key phrase here is assessed and managed reasonably in the circumstances. In making a decision, we have a continuum. On the one hand, a decision could be necessarily made on the fly, that's to say quickly with a minimum of consideration, instinctively even. On the other hand, a decision might benefit from protracted consideration with the pros and cons assessed and risks identified and addressed. So it's down to you, the decision maker, to demonstrate the process you went through in making a decision and that the process or lack of process was reasonable in the circumstances. It's for this reason that I believe that it's important that traditional tenets of the police service are ingrained into your thinking and instinctively impact upon your decision-making. The ACPO document also stated, in a fast-moving incident, the police service recognizes that it may not always be possible to segregate thinking or response according to each phase of the model. In such cases, the main priority of decision-makers is to keep in mind their overarching mission. What does it look like? So far, we have talked about decision-making in general, but now we are talking about the ACPO National Decision Model, and this is what it looks like. At the center we have a pentagon, surrounded by 5 circles representing the stages undertaken. We'll look at each one in detail shortly, but briefly the pentagon contains the statement of mission and values. The 5 stages include gather information and intelligence, assess threat and risk and develop a working strategy, consider policy and powers, identify options and contingencies, and lastly, take action and review what happened. Application. Before we get into the model in a little more detail, let's consider where the National Decision Model might be applied. In a nutshell, the National Decision Model is suitable for all decisions at all levels. It can be applied to spontaneous incidents or planned operations, by an individual or teams of people, and to both operational and non-operational situations. Decision makers can use it during the planning stage of a task or operation, to structure a rationale of what they did during an incident and why, and managers and others can use it to review decisions and actions taken. The inherent flexibility of the National Decision Model means that it can easily be expanded for specialist areas of policing. In every case, the model retains the same structure and format. However, users decide what questions and considerations they apply at each stage. Again, the ACPO guidance document states, in a fast-moving incident, the police service recognizes that it may not always be possible to segregate thinking or response according to each phase of the model. In such cases, the main priority of decision-makers is to keep in mind their overarching mission. The central concept of the model, the statement of mission and values, is the guiding light always. Statement of mission and values. People can find this central concept a little confusing. Statement of mission and values. What does it mean? Simply put, this is the values that define us and the organization, the standards by which we are judged. These values are the golden threads that should permeate all that we do. Over the years, there have been a number of expressions of how the police service should behave and the values it should hold. They include Pelian Principles, Police Pledge, the Oath Attestation of Office, Police Force's Statement of Values. Whilst the Human Rights Act has broader impact, it affects all public authorities, not just the police. It was designed to safeguard the public from abuse by the state and its agents. It therefore underpins how the police service behaves. In a nutshell, they are all about acting fairly, professionally, and with honesty and integrity. Copies of these documents can be found in the module resources. The National Decision Model is a cycle, analogous to a wheel. The way to look at the mission and values is not as a step or spoke, but as the axle around which the model spins. Mission of the Police Service. The mission of the police service is pretty much what it has always been and was defined by ACPO in July 2011 with this statement. The mission of the police is to make communities safer by upholding the law fairly and firmly, preventing crime and antisocial behaviour, keeping the peace, protecting and reassuring communities, investigating crime and bringing offenders to justice. This statement links back to the values we discussed earlier. Values of the police service. The values of the police service were similarly defined. They are: we will act with integrity, compassion, courtesy and patience, showing neither fear nor favour in what we do. We will be sensitive to the needs and dignity of victims and demonstrate respect for the human rights of all. We will use discretion, professional judgment and common sense to guide us, and we will be accountable for our decisions and actions. We will respond to well-founded criticism with a willingness to learn and change. We will work with communities and partners, listening to their views, building their trust and confidence, and making every effort to understand and meet their needs. We will not be distracted from our mission through fear of being criticized. In identifying and managing risk, we will seek to achieve successful outcomes and to reduce the risk of harm to individuals and communities. In the face of violence, we will be professional, calm and restrained, and will apply only that force which is necessary to accomplish our lawful duty. Our commitment is to deliver a service that we and those we serve can be proud of and which keeps our communities safe. To reiterate, members of the police service, both police officers and police staff, should keep the mission and values of the police service at the heart of every decision they make. Throughout the situation, you could ask yourself, is what I'm considering consistent with the statement of mission and values? You need to ensure that decisions reflect an understanding of the police duty to act with integrity, a willingness to take risks, and to protect the human rights of all. What would the police service expect of me in this situation? What would any victim or victims, the affected community and the wider public, expect of me in this situation? Gather information and intelligence. During this stage, the decision maker defines the situation, in other words, determines what is happening or has happened, and then clarifies matters relating to any initial information and intelligence. Initially, the decision maker needs to consider three basic questions. They are: what is happening? What do I know so far? And what further information or intelligence do I want or need? In order to elicit the additional information you may need in order to make a decision, it's useful to ask interrogative questions. Mr. Kipling's interrogative questions. What have Mr. Kipling's jam tarts to do with it? Nothing. However, his namesake Rudyard Kipling wrote the poem The Elephant's Child, an extract of which is illustrated in part here. I keep 6 honest working men. They taught me all I knew. Their names are what, why and when, and how and where and who. It's a formula for getting the complete story on a subject. The maxim of 5 W's and 1 H is that for a report to be considered complete, it must answer a checklist of 6 questions, each of which comprises an interrogative word. The principle underlying the maxim is that each question should elicit a factual answer, facts necessary with which to make an informed decision. Importantly, none of these questions can be answered with a simple yes or no. Interrogative questions may include the following. Questions beginning with what seek things that are or will be. For example, what was the subject doing? What happened? What happened next? What is or what was the real problem? Questions beginning with why seek cause and effect. For example, why did or why didn't the subject do a particular thing? Why did that happen? Why didn't something happen? Why did it happen then? Questions beginning with when seek location in time and can imply 2 different types of time, a specific single time or a duration. For example, when did it start? When did it finish? When did the contact or transaction occur? When was there activity or inactivity? When was the sequence repeated? Questions beginning with where seek to locate an action or event in 3-dimensional space. This can be simple space, a physical location, or a geographic space, a city. Where did or where will the incident occur? Where were the parties? Where was it lost or found or recovered or seen? Where did it start? Where did it end? Where was it kept? Questions beginning with who bring people into the picture, connecting them with actions and things. The who of many situations includes stakeholders, who are the people involved in an action or event. Who was involved? Who saw it? Who did something? Who initiated contact? Who was present at a location or event? Who was contacted before or during or after an event? And who is linked to the subject? Questions beginning with how seek details of action. They're good for probing into deeper detail of what has happened or what will happen. How may also be used with other words to probe into time and quantity. For example, how did or how will something happen? How frequently? How many? How did it begin and or end? How was it facilitated? The 6 honest serving men is a useful technique for ensuring information is obtained with which to make an informed decision. It is also a good checklist for ensuring that a decision achieves what's desired. Assess threat and risk and develop a working strategy. Having gathered the available information, the next step is to make sense of that information and assess the situation. Consider what you know, then consider any specific threat or risk of harm. Also consider the potential for benefits resulting from the decision you're about to make. Develop a working strategy to guide subsequent stages by asking yourself, what am I trying to achieve? For police officers, this would normally include apprehending the offender, maximising safety of officers, reducing risk to the victim and the public, amongst other things consider discrimination, good relations and equal opportunities. For police personnel generally, it might encompass all manner of objectives, reducing crime, improving efficiency, improving customer experience and satisfaction, and so forth. In assessing threat and risk, you should consider the victim, the subject, police personnel, and the wider community. It can be useful to assign a probability score to the threat or risk, for example, low, medium, high, or unknown. Any unknown risks should be treated as high. You should also consider whether immediate action is required to mitigate any threat or risks identified. When thinking about specific threat or the risk of harm, consider, do I need to take action immediately? Do I need to seek more information? What could go wrong, and what could go well? How probable is the risk of harm? How serious would it be? Is that level of risk acceptable? Is this a situation for the police alone to deal with? Am I the appropriate person to deal with this? During this step, you should think about the known unknowns, as these can impact upon your threat and risk assessment. It also enables you to decide whether further information can be gathered that might address such unknowns. Consider policy and powers. This stage involves considering what powers, policies and legislation might be applicable in a particular situation. You should consider what legal powers are needed or may be used. For example, an operational police officer might exercise a power of arrest, a power of entry, power to search, and similarly, a police community support officer might exercise the power to make a citizen's arrest, a common law power of arrest for breach of peace, or power to detain. A detention officer might exercise the power to search someone in custody. Other police staff may have powers as a consequence of their office they may be able to exercise. Regardless of your role, there may be national or local organisational policies or guidelines that apply to the situation in question. For example, in an occurrence of domestic abuse, there is a positive obligation on police officers to take reasonable action, which is within their powers, to safeguard the rights of victims and children. For all staff, but particularly intelligence staff, there are guidelines and policies in respect of disseminating or sharing information, and so forth. Within the police service, there are policies for very many situations. You should seek to familiarise yourself with those relevant to your particular role. It's worth remembering, though, that as long as there's a good rationale for doing so, it may be reasonable to act outside policy. It's also important to consider what legislation might apply in a particular situation. Clearly, police officers in particular need to know what legislation is relevant in a particular situation so that they know what offence or offences are being committed and how they might deal with offenders and, for that matter, victims. However, legislation impacts on every police employee, whether it be criminal law, administrative law, health and safety law, employment law, discrimination law, data protection, and the catch-all human rights. Regardless of role, it is likely that decisions you make should be made cognizant of the relevant laws. Exercise. What powers do you have in your role? Police officer. Power of arrest, power of entry, power to search, etc. Police community support officer. Power to make a citizen's arrest, a common law power of arrest for breach of peace, or power to detain. Detention officer. May have the power to search someone in custody. Financial investigator. Power to apply for seizure of assets under the Proceeds of Crime Act. Identify options and contingencies. This stage involves considering the different ways to make a particular decision or resolve a situation with the least risk of harm. It's necessary to consider the options that are available and the contingencies should the chosen decision not give the desired results. Options. This stage involves considering the different ways that a particular situation might be dealt with or resolved. In other words, identifying the range of options available. Usually, there'll be a minimum of 2 options: do something or do nothing. Sometimes, depending upon the situation, there are no options. The latter, do nothing, may be removed. For example, where an offender goes on the attack. Very often, though, there might be several options available. For example, an incident of dangerous driving in an emergency could result in arrest, a report for summons, words of advice, or nothing. For an operational police officer, the decision to do nothing and tactically withdraw might be the best option at that time, despite the discomfort that such an option might entail. A tactical withdrawal is not retreating, but the avoidance of unnecessary danger and vigilance until suitable resources are available. At a non-operational level, again, it is very likely that there will be several options available in any given situation. Options may involve money, resources, time, effort, politics, and a myriad of other factors that may play on a particular situation. As a rule of thumb, ideally the option chosen should be the one that offers the least risk of harm. In assessing what options are open to me, it can be useful to consider the following questions: the immediacy of any threat, the limits of information to hand, the amount of time available, the available resources and support, your own knowledge, experience and skills, and the impact of potential actions on the situation and the public. At some point, you may be called upon to account for your decision. It may be necessary to explain your thinking before a court, a tribunal, or a disciple hearing, or at the very least to colleagues. You should therefore, when reviewing the options available, consider the human rights implications. Human rights are not just for the offender. They're a balancing act. It's necessary to consider the human rights of the victim, the subject, yourself and colleagues, and the wider community. Ultimately, you should be able to say that the option you chose, the decision you made, was proportionate, legitimate, necessary and ethical, and reasonable in all the circumstances facing you at the time. Hindsight is a wonderful thing. You have the benefit of all the facts, or if not all the facts, perhaps more than was available on the day. The option you selected might turn out to have been the wrong one. This is why the process you went through is so important. Contingencies. The Robbie Burns quotation, "The best laid plans of mice and men often go astray," means that no matter how well you plan something, always expect the unexpected. In other words, just because you think you've done all you can for something to go right, something can still get messed up. For this reason, always have a plan B. Contingencies are simply provisions for when things go wrong. Ask yourself, what will I do if things do not happen as I anticipate? Remember, the national decision model is cyclical, which means at any point you can return to the beginning and start again, or fall back to a previous position. And it's continuous, so you can keep applying the model as circumstances and information changes. It's flexible. Take action and review what happened. This stage requires decision makers to make and implement appropriate decisions. It also requires decision makers, once an incident is over, to review what happened. Action consists of three components. They are respond, record, and monitor. Respond is simply about implementing the option that you have selected and asking yourself, does anyone else need to know what you have decided? Assuming that you have identified more than one option, select the one that best addresses the situation and implement it. Be decisive, but clearly your response could change as a situation develops. Be alert, open-minded, and flexible. Where appropriate, inform others of your decision. However, that doesn't mean that you should be telling someone of every decision you make. For police officers and other frontline staff, health and safety is paramount, particularly in a confrontational situation. Letting someone know what is happening is sensible. Your decisions should be within the scope of your authority. If in doubt, ask. Similarly, if you are inexperienced, seek appropriate guidance. Record. If you think it appropriate, record what you did and why. Clearly, it isn't possible to record every single decision you make. However, you should consider recording your more important decisions. Ultimately, you may have to justify your decision-making, and notes made at or soon after a decision make recall so much easier. A decision examined sometime after it was made can seem strange, even bizarre, particularly when all the facts are known. Remember, hindsight is a wonderful thing. Monitor. Having implemented your decision, keep an eye on its progress. Ask yourself what happened as a result of your decision, and was it what you wanted or expected to happen? Very rarely, when we have made a decision, can we just walk away from it, particularly in a policing environment. Be aware of what is happening and be prepared to amend or make fresh decisions. If the incident is continuing, go through the National Decision Model again as necessary. Review. Once the operation or incident is over, it is a useful practice to review your decisions and reflect on what happened. This is the case whether the outcome was a success or a failure. As we discussed earlier, we might get a successful outcome despite a bad decision, and similarly, a failure even though the decision was good. In either event, you need to know so that you can learn, and where appropriate, the organization can learn also. It's an important activity in which you can recapture the experience, think about it, mull it over, and evaluate it. This is primarily a personal experience, analogous to a personal blog. It allows us to assess our conclusions, actions, and work processes to further our personal and professional development. Use the National Decision Model to structure your thinking. Consider each component in turn, including the statement of mission and values, and minimally ask yourself, what lessons can I take from how things turned out? What might I do differently next time? A review can be a casual though structured exercise, where you simply run the matter through your mind, or if you want a more formal exercise, where you commit your paper to thoughts. Reflective practice. That's the National Decision Model. Many of you, certainly the police officers who started their police training in a university, will be familiar with reflective practice. And whilst we don't intend to labour the subject when undertaking a review of your decisions, it can be useful to use this method here to facilitate or assist the review that we've just discussed. So the first element is description. This is simply about asking yourself what happened as you progressed through the various stages of the National Decision Model. You shouldn't make judgments or try to draw conclusions yet, simply describe. The next element is feelings. What were your reactions and feelings? I know in this macho world of ours this isn't an easy one. Nevertheless, consider how you felt. Again, don't move on to analysing these just yet. The third element is evaluation. Ask yourself, what was good or bad about the experience? Make value judgments. For example, I enjoyed, I disliked. The fourth element is analysis. Ask yourself, what sense can you make of the situation? What was really going on? Were different people's experiences similar or different in important ways? It can help to bring in ideas from outside the experience to help you. Ask a friend what they thought. The fifth element is conclusions. Ask yourself what can be concluded about your own specific, unique personal situation or way of working from these experiences. Finally, a personal action plan. Ask yourself, what are you going to do differently in this type of situation next time? And what steps are you going to take on the basis of what you have learnt? Of course, the action plan need not be written down. What is important is that you put into practice what you have learnt. The mnemonic VIAPOAR will help users remember the key elements of the National Decision Model. Values, information, assessment, powers and policy, options, action, review. Reviews and debriefs. The National Decision Model can also be useful after the event for structuring the rationale behind the decision made by the decision maker, and as already intimated, it can be used to facilitate the informal or formal examination of decisions made and action taken. For example, in the case of the former, a debrief with a supervisor or a team briefing; in the case of the latter, a disciplinary inquiry or court case. Whatever the purpose, questions can be formulated around each of the components of the National Decision Model. It is ACPO guidance that even in circumstances where the outcome of a decision was not what would be hoped for, if that decision was reasonable in the circumstances, the decision maker should be supported by line managers and the organisation. National Decision Model and the courtroom. Solicitors and barristers already examine the decisions made by police officers and staff during the course of an investigation. It is inevitable, therefore, that they will examine the decision-making processes used in coming to a decision. If it cannot be demonstrated that the national decision-making model was used, or that there was justification for not using it, barristers will use that omission as ammunition to undermine what might otherwise be a very sound case. As we've already indicated, it isn't always possible to use the model in its entirety, but the mission statement and core values at the centre of the model should be so ingrained into your thinking that they will always influence your decision-making. If you're likely to attend court, I'd consider how to answer questions about your decision-making. If you used the model, be prepared to answer questions on how you did. If you didn't, be prepared to answer questions on why you didn't. In respect of the latter, such an answer might include something along the lines of, "The incident/situation happened so quickly that I made a spontaneous decision. However, as I regularly use the national decision-making model to aid my decision-making, the force's mission statement and core values are at the centre of my thinking. I believe the decision was a good decision at that time." Remember, however, you should be able to state the mission statement and core values because that could be the next question. It's acceptable to say that with the benefit of hindsight, a decision was bad. Don't try to defend the indefensible. A word of caution. In any pressure situation, things can go wrong, but particularly in an operational situation where you have to think on your feet. So take a deep breath. When the pressure is on. Under pressure, whether that be in working to unrealistic deadlines or being in a situation of danger, our brains may respond adversely. Explaining all the physiology involved is a course in itself, so the purpose of mentioning it here is simply to provide a summary of the process and to create awareness of what can happen if you don't guard against it. When a person is subjected to extreme stress, they may experience an adrenaline rush, which is the fight or flight response of the adrenal gland, in which it releases adrenaline. Following the release of adrenaline, one's body releases dopamine and endorphin, which can act as natural painkillers, so awareness of pain diminishes. An adrenaline rush also causes the muscles to perform respiration at an increased rate, thus increasing strength. The adrenaline's action on other body systems results in physical changes such as pulse rate increase, loss of appetite, increased perspiration, pupils dilating, vision and hearing becoming more acute, and reactions becoming faster. These are primitive responses inherited from man's earliest existence to prepare the body to fight or flee from perceived attack, harm, or threat to its survival. At the same time as these physical responses are occurring, the effect of the chemical changes on our brains can cause other responses that may have serious consequences. By its very nature, the fight or flight mode bypasses our rational mind and moves us into a state of attack. This can cause us to perceive almost everything as a possible threat to our survival. As such, we tend to see everyone and everything as a possible enemy. We may overreact to the slightest comment. Our fear is exaggerated. Our thinking is distorted. Everything is seen as a possible danger. We narrow our focus to those things that can harm us, and survival becomes the lens through which we see the world. It's very difficult to cultivate positive attitudes and beliefs when we're struck in survival mode. Our rational mind is disengaged, and our consciousness is focused on fear. Making clear choices and recognizing the consequences of those choices is unfeasible. We're focused on short-term survival, not the long-term consequences of our beliefs and choices. This phenomena is often referred to by police and others as red mist, and many actions have been taken under the influence of red mist, which have been bitterly regretted later, after normality has returned. What seemed necessary at the time is then seen as a calamitous error. What we are referring to is a loss of rationality in decision-making, brought about by a systems failure. Systems failure, characterized by: just as a computer can go haywire and produce flawed results if its processing system becomes faulty, the same can happen with regard to a human being and the use of his or her brain. In the circumstances which we're exploring, the systems failure is of a temporary nature and will at some stage return to normal. But during the period of failure, decisions are likely to be irrational. Following a return to rational thinking, it's often difficult for a person to understand how they could have made such decisions. But by then, it's too late, and consequences have to be faced. Systems failure is characterized by an inability to concentrate, impaired or irrational decision-making. Previously stored information such as learned skills can't be accessed. Loss of ability to assess available options. Inability to control emotions, which diminishes objectivity. Lashing out without prior thought due to frustration or fear. Under extreme pressure, the brain seeks to react quickly to that pressure, but it needs information from the part of the brain that's experiencing system failure. As a consequence, deprived of the information it needs, it leaps into flight mode, firing off commands without the benefit of information, taking instinctive actions. This results in an increased error rate and collateral damage. In other words, we make bad decisions and make mistakes. Combating systems failure. The most effective way of dealing with situations of systems failure is by avoiding them altogether. To do this requires a gradual process of getting to understand yourself and to be aware of changes in your moods or thinking. If you can identify within yourself when a systems failure is starting, you'll be able to regain control. If you're unaware of changes taking place within you, then the situation takes control of you and a systems failure is the likely outcome, with all that that involves. Self-awareness is the key to self-control. There are strategies for helping to combat system failure which should be initiated at the first sign. They include inhaling slowly through your nose, then exhaling slowly through your mouth. A rapid energy boost from eating a chocolate bar. Pressing your tongue upwards against your gums and then allowing it to rest, repeating this several times. So, to reiterate, if you're facing a stressful situation, consider these easy solutions. Remember, if you lose it, you'll make bad decisions.